I've never been a fan of U2. I don't know if I've ever even met a fan of their music. I don't think anyone has ever liked U2, and yet they are one of the most successful musical acts in the history of the world. It's not clear exactly how they managed to pull this off. They became, you might say, the world's elevator music, or maybe society's hold music. Something you hear all the time, whether you like it or not, and you don't really like it, but you also don't viscerally hate it. The music just is, it exists, and it exists everywhere, and nobody knows why, and nobody ever asks. And nobody can distinguish one U2 song from another. No one can. We know every U2 song, and yet we don't know any of them. It's one of the most confounding riddles of life. The man behind this mystery, Bono, was profiled yesterday in the New York Times in a piece titled, "Bono is Still Trying to Figure Out U2 and Himself." It only deepens the mystery to discover that the lead singer of the band also doesn't know why it exists or why anybody likes it. As for figuring out himself, Bono is in his mid-60s now. It's probably time to start arriving at a few conclusions before it's too late. He's apparently written a memoir, which explains why he was doing the New York Times interview. Most of the interview doesn't interest me, but there is one admission that did interest me. He says this, quote, "I ended up as an activist in a very different place from where I started. I thought that if we just redistributed resources, then we could solve every problem. I now know that's not true. There's a funny moment when you realize as an activist, the off-ramp out of extreme poverty is, commerce. It's entrepreneurial capitalism." Imagine that. Who could have ever guessed? It's capitalism. Now, I will say that, I don't treat capitalism like a religion as some establishment conservative types have done historically. I believe in the free market. I don't think that our free market principles, though, should preclude us from doing things like regulating big tech, holding it accountable for the ways that it censors and suppresses speech. I also don't think that defending the free market must necessarily mean that we have to be ardent defenders of behemoth transnational corporations. The relationship between government corporations, big tech, media, the kind of systemic human centipede, as I have previously described it, is such that the phrase free market barely even applies to these institutions. They've all become like quasi-governmental institutions in their own way. Further, I don't think that being a capitalist means that we must surrender our culture to smut and filth, insisting that any effort to enforce basic standards of human decency is somehow an assault on the free market or on free speech. So these are all important caveats, and perhaps caveat isn't the right word. They are more so specifications or descriptions of what I mean when I talk about capitalism. And the descriptions are important because not everyone means the same thing. In fact, Bono himself transitions immediately from admitting that capitalism is the best way out of poverty to making a sales pitch for globalization. He conflates the two, globalization and capitalism. But they're not the same thing. That is a specific sort of capitalism, the type that a left-wing multimillionaire celebrity is destined to support, but it's not the only option. And in the case of impoverished third world countries, what they need most is not globalization, but a legitimate local economy with thriving small businesses and so on. So with all that said, Bono is correct in the fundamental revelation at which he has arrived about 60 years late, that the way out of poverty is through entrepreneurial capitalism. He's wrong, though, that this is somehow a separate concept from redistributing resources. And that's kind of a false choice. Because one way or another, resources are going to be, if you want to put it this way, redistributed. That's because there are finite resources available. There's a certain amount of food, a certain amount of houses, cars, a certain amount of capital in the world. There are a lot of these things, and more can be produced and are produced every day, but the amount is still finite as opposed to infinite. It's just another way of saying that you can't make all of your necessities and your desired luxuries materialize out of thin air. If you want something or you need something, you have to obtain it. It must be transferred or distributed, if you like, into your possession. The only other option is to build, harvest, or hunt it yourself, but very few people in the modern world can live an entirely self-sustaining life, and it's not generally a path to prosperity. And besides, even if you go that route, you still need to obtain some of the tools necessary to do it successfully. So the question becomes not whether resources are distributed from one party to another. Everyone agrees on that. If you want to have any kind of economy, and every civilized society, and even uncivilized ones, must have economies, then that's just the nature of the beast. And broadly speaking here, simplifying to a significant extent, there are two ways of getting the resources from one party to another. You can do it by plunder and seizure, which is a stronger force taking the resources it wants and giving it to whoever they determine, starting, of course, with themselves. Or you can do it through a marketplace, where one party obtains the desired good or service from another party and in exchange pays an agreed upon price. Neither of these systems are perfect. Both can be abused. There will be poverty in both. Unscrupulous people will find ways to exploit the vulnerable in either case. But the question is, which system opens up the best path to human flourishing while offering fewer opportunities for exploitation and oppression? And the answer, as history has always shown, is the latter, the free market approach, which offers the most freedom, the most flourishing, and will be the most likely to lift people out of poverty. The problem with the seize and plunder system, whether it's a governmental entity doing it, or pirates, or Vikings, or a rival tribe, or whoever, is that you're relying on their benevolence to identify the parties who need the resources more and then deliver it. You're also relying on their perfect wisdom to know who deserves what. You are depending on them to have God's goodness and generosity and wisdom to go along with the godlike powers that they are wielding. And that faith is always, 100% of the time, misplaced. And this is why communism and socialism and all forms of governmental redistribution systems end in misery and catastrophe. One of the problems with progressives like Bono is that they don't respect or understand nature. And that applies to external nature, the planet's nature, the nature comprised of trees and oceans and clouds. It also applies to internal nature, human nature. They respect and understand that least of all. They don't understand that human beings are fallen creatures, and so all of our institutions will be at some level broken and unreliable, and so we can't give absolute power to any institution. The institutions, they can't carry the weight of that sort of trust and faith. They also don't understand tendencies and trends and the ways in which historical trends can and should guide our expectations of the future. The left just doesn't understand this. That's why they keep trying to, get socialism going again and again, because no matter how much misery it accounted for in the past. It's also why on the individual level, they think that we ought to continue releasing violent criminals back into our communities. Maybe they've changed. Maybe they've been reformed, they cry. Yeah, maybe, but almost certainly not. Anything is possible, but we have to make policies and decisions based on what is probable, not what is possible. It's possible that you could jump off of a 100-story building and survive. I mean, it's possible, technically. It's not impossible, it is possible, but it's certainly not probable. The probability is low enough that it's worth taking the elevator, even if that's a little bit slower. As for economic systems, a common citizen advocating for governmental control is like jumping out of that window and hoping that you're the one guy who has a positive experience with it. On the other hand, for the powerful, for the elite, socialism is not a plunge at all. It's an elevation to even greater heights, enjoyed at the expense of all those peons still lingering at ground level, and who will soon end up lower even than that. Now, these are all points quite obvious to me and to most of you. They were not obvious to Bono until now. I'm glad that he finally got it right, sort of got it right anyway. But unfortunately, for being late to the party, I must still say that he and his music are canceled. Mostly it's just his music, though, to be honest. That's canceled. All right, that'll do it for this portion of the show. As we move over to the members block, hope to see you there. If not, talk to you tomorrow. Godspeed.